everyone. I hope you're back after a refreshing lunch break. And we go ahead with the second session of the day, which is on the political ethics of temple architecture. Now, Professor Manu has shared his thoughts on Panchasakha devotionalism before on the very first day, and he's back with yet another interesting title to share his thoughts on. So for the next session, I would like to invite as a discussant Amal, who has been with us discussing before. Amal, as you know, is a research scholar at Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She's also a translator. She has translated into English 10th century Kannada epic Gada Yuddham by the noted poet Ranna, along with Professor R.V.S. Sundram. So without further ado, Amal, please take it forward from here.
Okay. The organizers of this workshop have great faith in Manu Devadevan's abilities because this is his second post-lunch session. I will not be introducing him again, but I will suggest to participants that if you're interested in understanding where his work sits within the field of medieval studies, you might like to look at an essay in a festschrift to Professor Keshavan Velutat called Cleo and Her Descendants. Professor Velutat himself taught in our neighborhood at Mangalore University, and the essay is called The Burden of Being Keshavan Velutat. It's a useful introduction. You can find it on academia.edu. And the essay takes the reader through the historiography of the medieval as it has been affected by wider trends in scholarship outside history as well. It probes some tensions between scholarly works, and it points to recent possibilities. There's been some very interesting new work. Sanjay Subramaniam has written about connected histories, and for participants in this workshop, if you're interested in themes like friendship, Daud Ali has a very nice essay. Indrani Chatterjee has written a book called Forgotten Friends. So I thought that might be useful. So previously, Manu Devadevan spoke about certain conflicts being addressed in the textual realm of the Lakshmi Purana. We return to Odisha this afternoon with another thematic, that of placemaking and sacred geography, by paying attention to the Skanda Purana and the Jagannatha Temple in Puri. As we know, something very dramatic happens in the 13th century, placing the king and priests in conflict. And this time we will hear, hopefully, another great story from the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya and the Skanda Purana. So Professor Devadevan, take it away till about 3 p.m. And after that, I invite participants to jump in with your thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much, Tanima and Amal. Professor Shivaprakash had suggested that I should speak about the relationship between temple architecture and ethics. It's a tricky area to stray into for two reasons. One, it is not possible to identify an intrinsic relationship between temple architecture and ethics. The connections that one can think of are, what shall I say, context specific, and the meanings that they generate are liable to undergo changes across time. That's one reason. Two, we can speak meaningfully about ethics in the context of temple architecture only if we have sculptural representations on the temple wall that can be interpreted with the help of various historical or aesthetic or hermeneutical tools. This is an area that has immense possibilities, and I'm sure you have learned a thing or two about the possibilities of interpretation from the lectures that Professor Parul delivered. We can also speak of ethics if there are narratives that are available to us, narratives concerning temple architecture or temple building. So I'll share one such narrative with you today. Now, I want to begin with a 12th century poem or a vachana as it is called. This is, in fact, has nothing to do with the discussion today, but I thought that this was an interesting way to commence the discussion. So the person who composed this vachana, Basava or Basavanna, was one of those saints from 12th century Karnataka who believed that it was possible to be an ascetic without necessarily renouncing worldly life. Now, he lived in the mid decades of the 12th century, and here is the vachana. The rich build temples for Shiva, master. Master is the address. Most of the vachanas, not all of them, but most of them are often dialogic. It is addressed to somebody or the other, sometimes a friend, sometimes to another fellow devotee, sometimes to the deity himself or herself. So this is the structure of most of the vachanas, which often gets lost in the process of translation, because translations often tend to read like monologues or soliloquy, taking away the dialogic context that we have. Anyway, the rich built temples for Shiva, master. What shall I do, master, poor that I am? My legs are pillars, body the shrine, my head is the golden capstone, master. Kudala Sangamadeva, that's his signature line. The standing will perish, the moving will not pass away. Here, Basava is actually representing the human body as a temple. It is a moving temple, as you can see. The structure of human body resembles the structure of a temple. Now, there's a comparison that he makes between the leg, the body, the head of a human being, and the pillars, shrines, and the capstone of a temple. Now, some 400 years later, an architect from Odisha called Niranjana Mahapatra wrote a text called the Shilpa Ratnakara. Now, in this 17th century text, Niranjana Mahapatra argued the other way around. He was, of course, not familiar with Basava or his poem, and his project had nothing in common with Basava's work, actually. But Mahapatra said that the temple is structured in the form of a human body. This is something that is widely discussed by 20th century Indology, but what is generally not recalled is the fact that this was a 17th century idea and not something that that was known since the beginning of temple building some 1800 years ago. Now, let me tell you a few things about the history of temple building in India before I get into the discussion proper. Now, the oldest surviving temples in India were built in the century and a half between 450 and 600 CE. So that is the latter half of the 5th century and the 6th century. There are about a dozen temples from this period. Two of them are in fact marvelous pieces of architecture. The Dashavatara temple at Devgarh in Uttar Pradesh, very close to Lalitpur, which is built sometime between 500 and 550 CE and which is now in ruins. And the Shatrughneshwara temple at Bhubaneswar in Odisha, dated to the second half of the 6th century. This is still in a good condition. Now, other temples are in places such as Tigawa, Bhumara, Nachana Kuthara, all of them in Madhya Pradesh, and at a few other places such as there's a place near Kanpur where most people argue we have the oldest surviving temple. This is the Bhitargaon temple, but there are disputes about the date. Some people try to date it to the 8th or even the 9th century. Now, in fact, this is not the period when temple building actually began in India. There are references to temples in inscriptions before the 5th century. Both inscriptions engraved on pieces of carefully worked stone, which historians call stone tablets, as well as inscriptions recorded on flat sheets of copper, which we call copper plates. Now we get reference to temples from at least the 3rd century onwards. Now in the mid 3rd century, a chief of the Chutukulananda family, historians call them the Chutus, a chief of this family gave away some land to a Brahmana and a temple. Now the chief ruled over a small territory in northwestern Karnataka with Banavasi as his headquarters. So the grant was actually made in this place. It was made in Banavasi. Now these endowments, these were endowments meant for religious purposes. Such endowments are called eleemosynary grant. So in this record, the land given to a Brahmana is called Brahmadeya. That's the standard expression for grants made to Brahmanas. And the one given to a temple is called Deva Bhoga. Deva Bhoga, of course, in the course of time becomes Devadana. So from the 6th, 7th, 8th century onwards, we do not hear so much of the Deva Bhoga. What we hear is the Devadana instead. Now, this grant is perhaps the first one to speak of a temple in India. We have several such examples from epigraphic sources between the 3rd and the 6th century, that is from inscriptions. Sometimes we have the name of a temple mentioned. At other times, we only get information about land given to the temple as endowment. The early Pallava inscriptions are actually a good example. You have in them information about 10 such temples. None of them have actually survived. There are no physical remains of any of these early temples. So those temples that have come down to us, the oldest of them, date back only to the latter half of the 5th century. Now, the kind of worship practiced in a temple in these early centuries is called the agamic worship, which is because the procedure for worship was laid out in a body of texts called the agamas. So it involved idol worship and was in this sense fundamentally different from the Vedic tradition, which did not follow idol worship. So, in fact, Puritans in the early stage of temple building, they seem to have scorned upon the practice of temple-based worship. The Manusmriti, for instance, is not really favorably disposed towards Brahmanas who perform services in a temple. But in the course of time, Vedic practices found their way into the temple services as well. So what we have now, by way of services in a temple, is a rather complex form of Vedic, Agamic, Tantric, and other autochthonous forms of worship. Now, it appears that the oldest temples, the ones that I mentioned, the ones dating from the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, etc., they seem to have been built of perishable materials such as wood, bricks that were not fired, and so on. So this seems to be the reason why we have several references to actually existing temples, but their remains have not been found. This begins to change from about the latter half of the 5th century, and then you have temples built of durable material coming up at places such as Kanchipuram, Mahabalipuram, Badami, Aihole, Pattadakallu, Bhubaneswar, and so on. And then the practice becomes widespread by the 9th century or so. So the period from 1000 to 1200 CE is perhaps the high noon, so to speak, the high noon of temple building in India. Some of the best known temples in India were built in this period, either built as new structures or as replacement for already existing structures. Now, my previous lecture in this winter school was on Bhakti, where I spoke about the Jagannatha Temple of Puri. There are actually a few temples in India that I find particularly attractive. You know, I'm particularly fond of them, and I keep talking about them again and again, such as the Lakshmi Narayana Temple complex in Chamba, or the Sun Temple in Modhera, Gujarat, the Parthasarathi Temple in Naramala, Kerala, and so on. So the Puri Temple belongs to this class. It's not the architecture of the temple that fascinates me. In architectural terms, the Puri temple is actually not a patch on the Lingaraja or the Brahmineshwara temples of Bhubaneswar, but Puri has several other attractions. So I'm going to take you to Puri once again. And what I'm going to say is mostly drawn from the essay that I prescribed for this lecture. So I'll partly present the argument and partly read the paper. Now, the Jagannatha Temple of Puri is made of chondrolite, unlike earlier temples which were made of sandstone. It is about 194 feet in height from the base, or about 214 feet when counted from the level of the street outside the temple. So it is located on a small mound, which is locally called a Nilachala, sometimes as Niladri or Nilashaila, which is about 20 feet in height. The temple, the Jagannatha, is a monument of the Kalinga school of architecture, which is a regional variant of the North Indian school, the famous Nagara school. Now, this style was popular not only in the areas that fall under the present-day administrative provinces of province of Odisha, but also in some parts of northern Andhra as well, because northern Andhra was also part of the Kalinga territory. That is, in the areas along the rivers Vamshadhara and Nagavali, you find a number of temples that can be classified as belonging to the Kalinga school. So the temples at Mukhalingam, for instance, Mukhalingam in Andhra belong to the same school. Now, this school of architecture developed in places such as Bhubaneswar, Mukhalingam, etc. So it went through several stages of change and transformation. I wish I could have shown you some visuals, but the problem that I had in the previous class, as it persists, there are problems with the video. Now, the oldest of these structures is the Shatrughneshwara temple of Bhubaneswar. This is a single cell shrine that dates back to the 6th century. It has only a garbhagriha, it's only a single cell. In the 7th century, another single cell shrine was built, but it was more elaborate in its carvings and sculpture and bigger in terms of size than the Shatrughneshwara. This was the Parashurameshwara temple. And sometimes in the 8th or 9th century, an additional cell called the Jagamohana was built in front of the Garbhagriha. The Jagamohana is the Odisha variant of what we call Mandapa. So the Parashurama as it stands today is a double cell structure with a sanctum, a Garbhagriha, and an assembly hall, that's a Jagamohana. And then came the Mukteshwara in the 9th century perhaps, which was built as a two-cell structure. It's full of elaborate and elegant carving, perhaps overdone, I would say. It has a little water tank attached to it. But the standard model of Kalinga architecture, at least in Bhubaneswar, comes with the Brahmineshwara temple, built in the early 11th century by Kolavati Devi, who was the mother of Somavamshi king Udyotakesari. This is sometime in the early decades of the second half of the 11th century. There's a date actually. The temple was completed in 1058. And then Udyotakesari himself builds the famous Lingaraja temple, which is an enlarged version of the Brahmineshwara in terms of architecture, the interiors, and so on and so forth. Both Lingaraja and Brahmineshwara are spectacular pieces of architecture. Any one of you visiting Bhubaneswar, I would strongly recommend to go to these two temples, even if you miss the others. So these are both built of sandstone. The Jagannatha, as I said earlier, does not carry any innovation when compared with Lingaraja or the Brahmineshwara, but it sort of ratified Kalinga architecture and it reified the whole thing, because after that, although we find certain transformations happening in the realms of architecture, some of the basic outlines had already been laid, and that was not tampered with to any significant degree after the construction of the Jagannatha Temple. So there was hardly anything unique to it in terms of innovation, except its height and the choice of condolite over sandstone as building material. The temple that originally stood on the hill on the Nilachala was dedicated to Purushottama and Lakshmi. In fact, the town was called Purushottama for a long time, until roughly the late 17th century. In fact, you have records from early 19th century as well, which keep referring to the town as Purushottama. So Puri is actually a kind of a modern version of the old name of the town, which is Purushottama. Now, Purushottama and Lakshmi represent the erotic aspect, and there is an argument made extensively by a number of historians that the combination of Purushottama and Lakshmi might have assumed the form of Lakshmi Narasimha in the Puri temple. Now, this was built, the temple was built in the early 12th century by Anantavarman Chodaganga. Now, Chodaganga's act of building a new temple adjacent to older political statement in its own right. Now, what is striking is the fact Chodaganga is a Shiva in coastal Odisha. This in itself is of some significance, but what is even more important is the fact that this was most temples in the region were built for Shiva. So there were hardly any Vishnu temples in Odisha in the early 12th century when Chodaganga decided to built this temple. The temple very close to it, the adjacent temple of Narasimha, is perhaps one of the few exceptions of a Vaishnava temple in early 12th century Odisha. And in the course of time, this predominantly Shaivite region almost turned completely to Vaishnavism, and one of the reasons is the kind of popularity that the Jagannatha Temple came to have in the course of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Now, it is not unlikely that this was a change in royal policy made for explicitly political reasons. It seems to have been brought into effect in the wake of Chodaganga's conflict with his mother's cousin, Kulotunga I of the Vengi Chalukya line, who had in 1077 ascended to the throne of the Cholas. Now, the Cholas, as some of you might know, were the biggest promoters of Shaivism in South India and had persecuted the famous Sri Vaishnava saint Ramanuja, who had to flee from Tamil Nadu to Karnataka. So there are legends of Ramanuja's visit to Puri and his supposedly failed attempt to introduce the kind of worship that he favored, which is the Pancharatra kind of worship. Now, there are also legends of Ramanuja's visit to an important pilgrimage center in Andhra, which is Sri Kurmam, where he transformed the Shiva temple into a Vishnu temple by persuading the locals that the linga that one sees in the temple, is actually not a linga but Kurma, that is Vishnu's incarnation as a tortoise. Chodaganga is therefore likely to have patronized Ramanuja, and the story of Ramanuja's failure to establish the Pancharatra form of worship was apparently an attempt to account for the changes brought into effect some centuries later during the time of Ananga Bhima III and the Suryavamshi Gajapatis. Now, the political uncertainty created in Odisha after the decline of the Somavamshi power in the decades following an invasion from Tamil Nadu. This is the famous invasion of Rajendra Chola, who marched up to the Ganga. So in the wake of this political uncertainty, it appears that Chodaganga chose to expand his control from northern Andhra into Odisha. Now, the decline of the Palas during the reign of Ramapala, the later half of it, enabled Chodaganga to make inroads into southern Bengal as well. Chodaganga seemed to have established a base at a place called Sarangagad, very close to modern Cuttack, for his operations in Odisha. But his sphere of being largely confined to northern Andhra. Most of his inscriptions are found from Kalinga Nagara, which was the old name of Mukhalingam. And it is here that in the last years of his reign, he faced serious competition or challenge from Chola subordinate, which is who was Gonka of the Velanati Chola line. Now, who built the original temple on the Nilachala is not actually known. So, nor is the antiquity of the shrine easy to establish. There is a stone inscription from a place called MAHE in Chhattisgarh, which mentions Purushottama, the name of the place. This, I guess, is perhaps the first unambiguous reference to Puri as a pilgrimage center. The mention in this inscription is to a place name and not to the deity, because you have a few earlier occasions where it is the deity that is mentioned, but here it's unambiguously the name of a place. So the place is said to be in Odra Desha, and the Maihar inscription records the construction of a temple for goddess Saraswati in Maihar, actually, in memory of a Brahmana boy called Damodara, who had renounced home and gone to Purushottama, where he died drowning in the sea. Now, Damodara, the inscription tells us, was the son of Saraswati in heaven. Once he happened to defeat Brihaspati in a debate, and Brihaspati was, of course, upset, and he cursed the boy to be born on earth. Now, when Saraswati petitioned Brihaspati for mercy, he relaxed the curse. He declared that the boy would live on earth only for a very short period, and that during a visit to Purushottama, he would drown in the sea and return to heaven. Now, a temple with an annual fair, a yatra, may have existed in Puri in the 10th century. We have reference to that in a work called Anargha Raghava, Murari's famous work. which begins by alluding to the spectators present at the Yatra of Purushottama. Now, in this context, Murari uses expressions such as Lavanoda Vela, the shore of the salty ocean, Vanali Tamala Karakandala, that is the forest of Tamala trees with their tender shoots, Kamala Kuchakala Shakeda, spotting with the pot-like breasts of Kamala. Variants of these kind of expressions generally figure in literature concerning the Puri temple. There is also reference to the deity as the Neelamani, which is a very interesting reference. Mahanilamane, that is the reference in this work. And this is an important piece of evidence for the existence of the temple because a number of sources from the time of the Skanda Purana itself refer to the original image in Puri as made of Neelamani, that is blue stone, which in modern parlance would be bluish black chlorite. It has in fact been argued that the sacred abode of Purushottama, Sri Dama Purushottamasya, figuring in one of the inscriptions from Andhra, this is the famous Kalidindi inscription of Rajaraja Narendra, might in fact be a reference to Puri. I'm not really convinced about this, but you do have this kind of a reference. Now, the town had acquired some degree of fame by this period, so much is clear. Now, if this is true, there should be no surprise in Chodaganga's choice of Puri for the greatest construction project of his career. For he was the son of the Chola king Veerarajendra's daughter, Rajasundari, and it is a sister of Veerarajendra that Rajaraja Narendra was married to. So, Chodaganga's arch rival, Kulottunga, was born of this particular marriage. Now, there are no allusions to a temple or a town, Pura or Nagara, per se, in the MAHE inscription or in the Anargharagava. While the proper noun Purushottama seems to refer to the town, both sources place it merely as a location on the sea. The first reference to a shrine occurs sometime around 1070 CE in a work called the Prabodha Chandrodaya, the famous play by Krishna Mishra. Here, we are introduced to the temple of Purushottama located in Utkala Desha, Ukkala Desado, so that is the Prakrit form of that. And as if the reference to Purushottama is incomplete without mentioning the sea, Krishna Mishra tells us that the temple is situated on the shores of a sea. In fact, accounts from the 14th century present the sea as the limits of the temple's sacredness, and pilgrimage to Puri is incomplete without a sacred bath in the sea. This is the kind of picture that we have there. So the MAHE account of Damodara attaining liberation by drowning in the sea indicates that the holiness of the sea was perhaps well acknowledged even in the 10th century. So it was then only to be expected that Chodaganga's grandson would place the sea in bold relief while describing the construction of the temple in his Dasgoba copper plate inscription. Dasgoba is a place very close to Puri, about 15 kilometers or so from there. So the god Purushottama, the Dasgoba plates tells us, has the earth for his feet, the regions between the earth and the sky, that is the Antariksha, for his navel, the directions for his ear, the sun and the moon for his eyes, and the sky for his head. Who is capable of building a temple for him? The earlier kings had therefore given it up, but Gangeshwara, that is Chodaganga, succeeded. So until the construction of the temple, Purushottama lived in the sea where Lakshmi was born. So living in the sea of milk, that is Kshirabdi, that belonged to his father-in-law, was a matter of disgrace for the great Lord. So Purushottama was thus delighted to obtain a residence of his own when the king Chodaganga decided to build this temple. And equally delighted was Lakshmi, because she held that living in the husband's house was always better than living in a father's house. This is what is described in the Dasgoba copper plates of Chodaganga's grandson, Rajaraja III. Now, the portrait of Chodaganga in the Dasgoba copper plates is not on the lines of the classical image of divine kingship that we gather from works such as the Manusmriti or in inscriptions of the Cholas or the Rashtrakutas. That's a thing of a very different order. It's also not in tune with the form of divine kingship practiced in peninsular India between the 7th and the 12th century. Now, divine kingship as a political praxis had enabled the Rashtrakuta ruler Amogavarsha Drupatunga, the 9th century king, to be represented as Vishnu, and the Chola king Rajaraja I to be represented as Shiva. So that was the practice. So this practice had come into disfavor by the end of the 12th century. So the eastern Gangas were apparently not drawn by the prospects of divine kingship. The Prashastis in Chodaganga's inscription do not put forward any claim to divinity. All we hear is that one of the king's predecessors, Guna Maharaja, was as valiant as Vishnu. When placed against this backdrop, Chodaganga's picture in the Dasgoba plate is suggestive of a change in royal policy. So the great builder of the Puri temple is now a kind of supra-divine figure. He is not a deity for sure, nor is he a worshipper of Purushottama or a patron of the temple, cult centering on it. He is simply the benefactor of the great God who pervades over the cosmos. He provides Purushottama with a home and liberates him from the disgrace of living at his father-in-law's residence. He liberates the Supreme Lord of the disgrace that he faced by living in his father-in-law's place. So the temple, sorry, the temple is thus the place where the omnipresent Lord finds a finite tangible expression. So in this sense, the temple is meant in the Dasgoba plates to be the fulcrum of the cosmos and a metonymy for the omnipresence it embodies. So it is only befitting that the temple that Chodaganga built to rescue Purushottama from infamy was the tallest of its times, 4 feet lesser than the Brihadeshwara in its masonry, but 8 feet higher than it when we include the Nila Chakra. The chakra is a kind of, it's a discus on top of the temple. So only once before the 20th century was a temple with a taller Vimana built. This was the 13th century Sun Temple of Konark. But this Vimana has not survived. It collapsed in the course of time. Now, Chodaganga's association with the Puri temple is something that we know from his own times, not necessarily from his grandson Rajaraja's times, although no records from his reign identify him as the builder of the temple. Now, the king gave away the village of Malada for lighting 20 perpetual lamps. The inscription recording this grant states that a certain amount of ghee was also supplied to the temple from the cows that the temple had maintained. But what is interesting is that there are no reference to land grants made by Chodaganga. Now, Chodaganga was the first king of Odisha to be commemorated as a divine figure. The Charteshwara inscription of the time of Ananga Bhima III, that is his great-grandson, identified him as an incarnation of Narasimha or Narahari. So in an inscription, in an earlier inscription, the Somavamshi ruler Yayati II was declared by his son Udyota Kesari to be a representative, Pratinithi of Madhusudana, that is Vishnu. Note that he is only a representative and not Madhusudana himself, nor his incarnation. So both these, the one that speaks of Yayati and the one that speaks of Chodaganga, are posthumous references. And the earlier reference that I mentioned of Guna Maharaja being equated with Vishnu is also a posthumous reference. Now, by appropriating a temple that was known more for its geographical settings and holiness than for its royal connections, Anantavarman Chodaganga brought into effect a change in the meaning of the temple. He transformed the temple into a monument that proclaimed the power of the state. Towering over the town and overlooking the sea, the temple that was visible from great distances on land and sea came to symbolize political power in an ideal form. At the same time, this is the important point there, Chodaganga stayed short of integrating the temple and the state in a way that the Chola king Rajaraja first or Rajendra first had done. The Puri temple was neither the headquarters of the state nor its symbolic center, although its soaring spire was meant to be a symbol of royal authority. Chodaganga retained his base in the distant Kalinga Nagara, that is Mukhalingam. So this place the temple in a doubly advantageous position. On the one hand, it gained royal patronage and all the symbolic and substantial benefits, especially the control over land that accrued from it. That was the first advantage. The second was that its physical distance from the state enabled it to evolve in its own ways. It gave it a measure of autonomy, and the temple began to develop in its own ways. So this pattern is generally noticed in most successful pilgrimage centers in India between the 12th and the 19th century. Temples established by the state, note this, temples established by the state were abandoned soon after or within a few centuries of the collapse of the dynasty. Instances of this kind are numerous. We can think of the Tanjore temple, the one in Gangaikonda Cholapuram, Kanchipuram, Mahabalipuram, Belur, Halebedu, Pattadakallu, Khajuraho. Now, the fate of temples established by communities, village assemblies, and local chiefs and elites, and remaining outside the sphere of royal patronage, has not been different either. Even they faced a similar fate. Now, the temples that have succeeded in evolving into prominent centers of pilgrimage enjoyed a distinct quality. They were of obscure local or tribal origins, but were able to secure royal patronage at some point in their existence. Tirupati is a glaring example. Madurai is another. One can, in fact, give a long list of such temples: Srirangam, Guruvayur, Pandarpur, Udupi, Parani. So the Puri temple belongs to this particular league. Patronage from the state at a later period, placed these temples in a position of advantage, enabling them to expand their resources, the base of the resource base, by acquiring vast land holdings, not always in the form of royal grants, but more significantly in the form of gifts, donations, and votive or thanksgiving presents from landed elites, peasant proprietors, mercantile classes, pilgrims, and others. Now, such gifts or donations or presents were less likely to be made to a temple that had no royal connections at all, or to a temple whose destiny was exclusively linked to and limited by the fortunes of a single royal dynasty. So it was easier for the landed temples to find reified geopolitical expression in the form of a temple territory relationship. So this picture urges us to be wary of existing perspectives that tend to explain historical developments in pre-colonial India as either the product of state making, state formation, and its legitimacy seeking enterprise, or as the expression of local autonomy and community heritages. So the picture is more complex than the one found in the state-centric and community-centric models. Now, by the early 13th century, the political conditions in peninsular India had undergone considerable transformation. It led to what historian Nilakanta Shastri has called an epoch of great changes in the political map of the South. The Kalyana Chalukya state had withered away. The Hoysalas of Dora Samudram had consolidated their hold over southern Karnataka and also made inroads into Tamil Nadu. Under the prodigious Ganapati, the King Ganapati, the Kakatiyas of Warangallu had expanded into the Krishna Delta, which was hitherto under the Vengi Chalukyas and Velanate Chola control. The Cholas, under Kulotunga III and his successors, Rajaraja III, faced severe setbacks following invasions from the Pandyas and the Hoysalas. The power they had wielded came to a symbolic end of sorts when the Kadava chief, Pope Perinjanga, took Rajaraja III prisoner. The eastern Gangas faced no threat from the southern quarters in the early 13th century, not even from Kakatiya Ganapati. In fact, it has been argued that Ganapati was frustrated in his ambitions in the northern direction by the presence of the eastern Gangas, although it is not certain if Ganapati actually nursed such ambitions. So it is then remarkable that Ananga Bhima III moved the eastern Ganga base from Mukhalingam to Puri, which is Cuttack in Odisha, the modern Cuttack. So this was in all likelihood occasioned by the invasion of Ghiyasuddin Iwas Khilji from Bengal sometime between 1212 and 1225. Ananga Bhima III, as I said earlier, was the great grandson of Chodaganga. He replaced the less prevalent idea of divinity that we find in Dasgoba plates with the new ideal of sacred kingship. It's not divine kingship; it's sacred kingship. There's a difference there. I'll explain that in a moment. So here, the king was not so much a divine figure as a figure made sacred by his associations with divinity. Okay, so in the inscriptions of his time, the king Ananga Bhima is often styled as Purushottama Putra, Rudra Putra, and Durga Putra. Historian Herman Kulke has identified the three deities as Purushottama of Puri, Rudra as Shiva Lingaraja of Bhubaneswar, and Durga as Durga Viraja of Jajpur. Ananga Bhima seems to have established a base at Chaudwar near Cuttack in the wake of Ghiyasuddin's attack, the attack from Bengal. His general, Vishnu, repulsed the invader. Now, Ananga Bhima may have begun the construction of the city of Cuttack shortly thereafter. The city was called Abhinava Varanasi. The work was completed, the construction of the city was completed in 1230, and the capital moved from Kalinga Nagara, that is Mukhalingam, to this new city on the river Mahanadi. In the same year, 1230, Ananga Bhima granted land to the Puri temple and its priests twice and visited the temple on a pilgrimage. He also built a new temple at Cuttack. In the same year, his wife offered gifts to the Alladanatha temple in Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu. In the inscription recording the gift, she reinforced the idea of sacred kingship by identifying Ananga Bhima as Purushottama's son, ruling under the deity's orders as a deputy of sorts. So the authority of the Puri temple was rendered symbolically political and integrated with the region over which Ananga Bhima ruled, buttressing the meaning of the temple as an expression of political authority. The temple thus became the symbolic headquarter of the state and the symbolic center of the territory, which it was not in the time of Anantavarman Chodaganga. So within a period of 4 generations, you see that the meaning of the temple is undergoing significant change in respect to the relationship that it had with the state. Until 1198, when Rajaraja issued the Dasgoba grant, the deity in the Puri temple was Purushottama. We had a joint image of Vishnu and Lakshmi in their erotic aspect worshipped in the temple. However, the Pataleshwara temple inscription, Pataleshwara is a small cave within the Puri Jagannatha Temple. So there's an inscription there. This speaks of the deities as Hali. Hali is the one who holds the hull. That is the plow. That is Balabhadra. Chakri, that is the one that wields the chakra. This is Krishna. And Subhadra. So an inscription dated 1237 refers to the deities as Hali, Chakri, and Subhadra. That is Balabhadra, Krishna, and Subhadra. The same set of deities was consecrated a few decades later in 1278 in the Ananta Vasudeva temple of Bhubaneswar, built by Chandrika, who was Ananga Bhima's daughter. The Ananta Vasudeva was, like the Puri temple in the Dasgova plates, identified as the temple of Purushottama, Prasadam Purushottamasya. Now, these two inscriptions, the Pataleshwara and the Ananta Vasudeva inscriptions, point to a major intervention that might have taken place between 1198 and 1237 in reforming the cult in the Puri temple. Given Ananga Bhima's excessive interest in the Puri temple and accounts of his acts recorded in the 17th century Madala Panji, I'm sorry, this is a record of the record maintained by the Puri Jagannatha Temple. So when we look at this, we may agree with Herman Kulke that this transformation was the result of Ananga Bhima's intervention. So to replace the existing deity with a set of new ones in a temple that had an established tradition of at least 3 centuries was by any count an act of impudence. It would not have been possible to bring this change into effect without antagonizing the established priestly orthodoxy of the temple. But then, Ananga Bhima had reasons to ignore any dissent or protest that would have arisen by his act of replacing the deities. He made rich grants of land to the Puri temple, which none of his predecessors had done, and this left little room for grievances arising from other causes. Besides, he was a ruler mighty enough to expel the Yavanas, the so-called new political threat in northern India, who had only a few decades ago commenced their reign from Delhi, occupied Varanasi and parts of Bengal, defeated the Senas, and reduced the famous Nalanda to rubble. Of course, we know that the Nalanda story is not true, but you had these kind of legends circulating about them. So grievances of the orthodoxy had to take a back seat in this mightest right kind of an age. Now, where did the old image go? What became of it after the Trinity replaced it? We know that there was an earlier image, perhaps of Lakshmi Narasimha, or at least Purushottama and Lakshmi. Now that was replaced by a new set of deities, Balabhadra, Subhadra, and Krishna. So what became of the old image? So I don't think the sources available to us give us a credible answer. So Herman Fulke posits that Ananga Bhima might have moved the old image to his new temple in Cuttack, and that this might have been the image which was destroyed during Firoz Tughlaq's campaign of 1361. While there is no evidence to substantiate this hypothesis, the argument advanced is certainly of some interest. Now the question remains, what became of the old image? This question was made possible only after the great rupture with the past that Ananga Bhima had brought into effect. So by the 14th century, the need was perhaps felt to answer this question. The Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya of the Skanda Purana came up with a fabulous answer that would transform the meaning of the temple and the territory for centuries to come. This is the next phase of change in the meaning of the temple. So the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya, I'll refer to it as Mahatmya simply, was composed at a time when priestly power in the temple had grown strong enough to emerge as a counterweight to royal power. So I discussed this briefly in the previous lecture. It was a hegemonic text. The Mahatmya was a hegemonic text with a counter-hegemonic function to perform. It was a text that reified the territory and released it from temporal control. With a cleverly crafted narrative, the king and his establishment were reduced to a position bordering on insignificance. So in the process, the linear relationship of temple, territory, and state, the one that Ananga Bhima had established and some of his successors had followed, were thrown to the winds. Instead of that, the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya placed a new relationship that would turn out to be favorable to the priestly classes and be detrimental to the interests of the king. So this involves placing the temple at the center of a territory whose holiness is believed to increase concentrically as one moved from the periphery to the center. The temple was thus the core of a holy territory. So characteristic of this holiness were two attributes, divinity and eternity. Now the king was only one of the many participants in the affairs this newly imagined space generated, where everything that transpires was now imagined as a cosmic drama that Vishnu enacts. So the king had no claim to a centrality in the affairs concerning the temple. So this is where you have the counter-hegemonic dimension of a text that was otherwise orthodox to the last letter. So this is a great distance that the affairs of the temple has traveled since the days of Anantavarman Chodaganga, where he stood as a benefactor to rescue the deity from infamy. But now a situation has emerged where royalty through this narrative is more or less shown its place. The Mahatmya tells the story of the construction of the Puri temple and the institution of its rituals and festivals. Its tropes are familiar, its strategies of narration are formulaic. Even then, it is not a mere legend that came to be incorporated into the body of an ever expanding Skanda Purana. Rather, it is a premeditated project that creates a sacred geography by effectively changing the meaning of the temple and its relationship with the territory. How does the text accomplish this? The Mahatmya introduces Puri as the Tirtha where Vishnu lives with his human spot and does that in the form of wood. It is the abode of Vishnu, his residence. Puri lies in the region along the region to the north of the sea and to the south of Mahanadi, which is a waterlogged territory that confers the fruits of all tirthas. From the forest of Ekamra Kshetra is Bhubaneswar. From there to the southern ocean, each step is superior to the preceding one, getting gradually holier. On the seashore in Nilachala, being wrapped in Vishnu's Maya, it is not accessible even to Brahma and not knowable even to the gods and demons. It is in this place, this most divine of places on earth, unaffected by creation and destruction, that Vishnu dwells. So this is more or less equating the place with Vaikuntha. The Nilachala is so sacred that even a crow was once able to attain liberation by plunging into its sacred waters, casting doubts on the opinion of the Vedanta that only human beings are capable of liberation. Puri is eternal. The waters, the Kalavahini fire, and the Samvartaka clouds cannot destroy it. So much so that, other than Vishnu, the Kshetra of Puri was all that remained in the great deluge. Everything else was submerged. It is to this place that the sage Markandeya arrived to take shelter, wading through the deluge of destruction. So the sage had a vision of Vishnu in Puri and attained freedom from death. While this description appears as nothing more than a set of stock expressions in Skanda Purana's all too familiar scheme of things, it strikes us by the fact that the defining character of Puri in this account has little to do with attributes that can be called as constituting human volition. This is a significant ideational departure from the earlier traditions recorded in the Mahabharata, the Vayu Purana, the Matsya Purana, the Vishnu Purana, and other such sources, where the territory is always named after and defined in relation to a prince. And this particular territory, Kalinga, is one such territory. And Kalinga, the person, the man called Kalinga, is one of the 5 sons that the queen Sudeshna bore for her husband, Bali. Bali is her husband. She bore these sons through the sage Dirghatamas. So in this early tradition, there is manifestly a political representation of the territory. Now the Mahatmya, the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya, tactically moves away from this widely accepted representation of the territory. The picture of divinity and eternity drawn in the opening description of Puri reifies the territory and informs the rest of what the Mahatmya is going to tell us. Puri, or the region to which it belongs, is never represented in the text as a territory under royal control. Puri is never represented in the text as a territory under royal control. Political projects, in this case the projects of Chodaganga and Ananga Bhima, etc., are effectively thrust aside. In fact, none of these rulers figure in the Skanda Purana. There is no Rajaraja, there is no Chodaganga, there is no Ananga Bhima. So it's a completely different order of things. Now the Mahatmya then introduces us to a king who is the hero of the story. Indradyumna, the hero, was the ruler of Avanti. He lived in the Krita Yuga of the first Manvantara. It was he that built the temple. Now here is the story. Once while praying in his temple with the desire to know of the place where Jagannatha could be seen, Indradyumna learns of Purushottama Kshetra. Vidyapati, the brother of Indradyumna's priest, is deputed to Purushottama Kshetra on a mission. Vidyapati reaches Purushottama Kshetra, where he finds a hunter, Shabara, called Vishwavasu. He is the chief of the Shabara. He has been secretly worshipping the image of a deity carved of blue stone, Neelamani. Vishwavasu and his folks have been living on the leftover of the food offered the deity by the celestials that descend down to worship the image every day. Now Vidyapati meets Vishwavasu and requests him to take him to the shrine of Jagannatha. Now Vishwavasu is in a dilemma. He is in no mind to take Vidyapati to the shrine and wonders how the closely guarded secret of the existence of Jagannatha has been leaked out. And this Jagannatha, as it turns out, is the rich source of subsistence for Vishwavasu as well as for his lineage. Now he is also worried that he might incur the wrath and curse of Vidyapati, the Brahmana that he is, if he refused to take him to the shrine. The hunter chief soon realizes that the image was destined to exist only for a parardha. Parardha is a duration in the cosmic scheme of things, and it is half the life of Brahma. So this image was destined only to exist for a parardha, and this great epoch is now coming to an end. So he reconciles with the inevitable and takes the visitor to the shrine. Vidyapati has a glimpse of the deity. Shortly thereafter, Indradyumna reaches Purushottama Kshetra along with Brahma's son Narada. Unfortunately, he is too late. Before his arrival, Purushottama Kshetra is visited by a storm and the image vanishes in the sands. The king is deeply aggrieved by the disappearance of the image, but he is favored by a glimpse of the deity in the form of Narasimha. On the advice of Narada, Indradyumna performs 1,000 horse sacrifices, 1,000 Ashwamedas. This act earns him the blessings of Vishnu, Lakshmi, Brahma, and sages such as Sanaka, who offer him darshana in a dream. Now, a banyan tree appears miraculously on the seashore. Narada advises Indradyumna to fetch the tree to the blue hill and worship it. When this is done, a divine voice emanates from the tree announcing the arrival of a carpenter to carve 4 images from it. He carved the image of Jagannatha, Subhadra, Balabhadra, and Sudarshana in 15 days. Indradyumna now starts building a temple for the deities. Then, one day, he leaves with Narada for the world of Brahma, where he invites the latter to the temple to sanctify and commission the images for worship. Brahma accepts the request, but not before enlightening the king to the fact that the temple he built was many million years old and that Indradyumna's dynasty does not exist on earth anymore. For although Indradyumna had spent only a few hours in the world of Brahma, weren't a few hours of Brahma equivalent to several million human years? The first Manvantara had drawn to a close. It is now the second Manvantara of the second Manu, that is Swarochisha Manu. Indradyumna returns to the earth. The temple that he had started building has been completed in his absence. The Manvantara in which it was built has come to pass. Although everything, including the sun and the moon, are destined to disappear at the end of a Manvantara, the temple has remained there, strong and resplendent, as if it is a physical manifestation of eternity. Brahma then descends on earth in the company of all gods, and as instructed by him, his son Padmanidhi and the king make all preparations for the great event, including the construction of chariots for the famous Rath Yatra. Vishwakarman arrives to give a final touch to the temple. Brahma installs the wooden images for the worship. Pleased with Indradyumna's devotion, Vishnu assumes the form of Narasimha and blesses him and prescribes the rites and ceremonies to be observed in the temple. So this in brief is the story told elaborately in the Mahatmya. So it needs no labored arguments or flights of fantasy to bring to light the political undercurrents of the story. By attributing the construction of the temple to a king who is neither from within the region nor desirous of extending sovereign control over it, the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya renders political claims over the temple drawn from the erstwhile temple territory state equation indefensible. As if to reinforce this strategy, a great gap in time is introduced between Indradyumna's visit to Brahma and his return, and the royal line of the king brought to an end in the course of the millions of human years that have elapsed in the meantime. Divine intervention permeates the Mahatmya to the last letter, as it were. The tree of which the images are carved is the body of Vishnu. None other than Vishnu, disguised as a carpenter, carves the image, and the great Lord, in his form as Narasimha, prescribes the mode of worship and observances in the temple. So, royal agency in the person of Indradyumna has little to say in this whole affair. Now, this is a far cry from the audacious reforms that Ananga Bhima had carried out in the temple in the 13th century. Although the construction of the temple is attributed to Indradyumna, the king is said to have engaged all devout people from Bharatavarsha for the project. Work on the temple is completed in Indradyumna's absence, and as if to give a divine touch to the already divine structure that has braved the test of time, Vishwakarma's services are availed of before the images are finally commissioned for worship. Puri is holy enough to grant room at the feet of Vishnu in Vaikunta, even for a low-born crow that had had a holy dip in its sacred waters. Yet, poor Indradyumna earns a place for himself in Brahmaloka only by constructing the temple, which in turn is made possible only after he earns Vishnu's blessings by accomplishing the insufferable task of performing 1,000 Ashwamedas. What a contrast to the ease with which Chodaganga built a temple to rescue the great Lord from disgrace. By invoking the tropes of divinity and eternity, the Mahatmya reifies the temple as a suprahuman structure resting in the in the heart of a reified and therefore suprahuman territory. Human agency in general and royal agency in particular is placed in a position of subordination to the agency, that is the great divine spot or Leela of Vishnu. And the indisputable agency of Indradyumna is itself reified by placing the acts of the king in a Manvantara too distant to fathom. So there is clearly a hiatus between the account generated from the Eastern Ganga inscriptions and the narrative recounted in the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya. While the inscriptions were royal documents with a political agenda that is hard to miss, the authors of the Mahatmya had other axes to grind. They imagined a territory and a temple that was beyond temporal control of any kind. At the same time, the Mahatmya's emphasis on divine intervention and the sacerdotal aspects of the temple underwrote the process of pilgrimage and facilitated the assertion of priestly power. Attempts made in the 15th century by the Suryavamshi Gajapatis to reform the rituals and ceremonies of the temple were successful only to the extent that they were able to secure the goodwill of the priestly classes and the Brahmanas in the region through land grants. The Suryavamshis gave away villages in great numbers as Shasana grants to the temple, its priests, and numerous Brahmana beneficiaries. Nevertheless, their relationship with the priestly power was apparently fraught with friction, which I described in the previous lecture. The Suryavamshis eventually gained lasting access to the temple and were allowed to use the pompous title of Chalanti Vishnu or living or walking Vishnu only after they enlisted themselves into the service of the deity as the first servitor, the Adya Sevaka, and arrogated for themselves such ceremonial functions as the Chera Pahara, that is sweeping the chariot during the annual Rath Yatra. In other words, the king became a part of the landed priestly establishment as its preeminent representative. So what we have here is not an order of things where centrality rests either with the state or with the community. What we have rather is a new trend in landlordism that found expression through the control exercised over land with the temple as its instrument. How this transition came to transpire is another story, but it is with the account of Indradyumna in the Skanda Purana that this story can fruitfully begin. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devadevan. I'm going to open the floor, so to speak, for questions. Please raise your hand. Okay, while people are still thinking about this very rich sort of description of relations between the temple and royal power, I'll ask a question. I was wondering how the Puranas as a class of texts become hegemonic, as you said, because what you do is you show that the Puranas, like within themselves, they are doing different things historically, and they're also responding, I think, to other kinds of texts like the royal inscriptions. So how do the Puranas become hegemonic?
Well, I guess because the Puranas, unlike other class of religious literature, are much more accommodating in the sense that they tend to bring a large number of autochthonous religious traditions, things that we now identified as a tribal and so on and so forth, into the fold of either Shaivism or Vaishnavism or Shakti worship, one of these three. And they do it by a variety of strategies, actually. For example, if you look at the Lalita Sahasranama or the Vishnu Sahasranama, both of them part of one or the other Puranas, of course, added to it at a much later date, you will notice that one of the names of Vishnu, for example, is Ashwatha. Another name of Vishnu is Ashoka. All these are trees, basically. So it appears that there were communities which worshipped one or other form of deity in their totemic form, and their absorption into Shaivism or into Shakti cult or into Vaishnavism happens by a number of strategies, the Sahasranam, for example, being one of them. So this way, unlike other classes of literature, that is, unlike the Agamas, for instance, or the Vedic corpus, the Puranas tend to be much more accommodative. So that is one way in which they become hegemonic. The other thing that I would lay stress upon is the fact that these are narratives, unlike the Agamas or the Vedas or the Upanishads, which have many things to say, but which doesn't, at the end of the day, have an interesting story to tell. The Puranas have a wide range of fascinating stories to tell, which is another way, I guess, of gaining the kind of popularity that the Puranas such as the Bhagavata or Vayu Purana or the Skanda Purana managed to gain in the long run. The Skanda Purana is particularly interesting because any place of worship that aspired some kind of respectability could get into that mode by becoming a part of the Skanda Purana. All that the people associated with this temple had to do was compose maybe 100 or 200 hymns in preferably in the Anushtuk meter in Sanskrit, and attach it to the Skanda Purana. And the corpus of Skanda Purana, in fact, kept expanding well into the 19th century. To a certain extent, that is true also of Bhagavata, but at least many of the sections added to the Bhagavata were not recognized as legitimate. But that's not the case with Skanda Purana. It kept on expanding well into the 19th century. So this, I think, is one of the reasons why they became hegemonic in the way they did.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Any other questions? Please raise your hand or put your questions in the chat box. I'm also going to use this opportunity because our sessions seem to be quite discreet. They don't always speak to each other. There was a question in the previous session about the change in monumentality and the amount of work that went into Hoysala monuments, that kind of attention and effort sort of changes with the Vijayanagara period. And I was wondering whether you wanted to take a stab at that and explain, because someone asked what led to these changes.
Could you briefly tell me what this is pointing to?
Yeah,
Because I was not there in the lecture in the morning.
Yeah,
although I'm quite happy that now the Hoysala temples are going to be considered for World Heritage status.
Oh, yeah. Someone prepared a dossier.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I wasn't part of much of the session, but I think Bimal, was it, asked a question about Hoysala architecture, temple monuments, and whether there is a difference between, the kind of work that has gone, the intricate work that you find in Hoysala architecture, even in the kind of script and the beauty of the script. This is the standard narrative, right? That they're extremely beautiful and intricate monuments. And then when we get to the Vijayanagara period, the temples have less of that energy. And why does that happen? Why does the writing, the script also seem less attentive?
Yeah, Amal, I think I was the person who was asking that question in the morning.
Yes.
Yeah. So Professor Manu, the question was about like the specific, I think Amal has already provided you a summary. The specific difference that we were looking at is because Professor Parul was talking about Belur and other temple. And then my question came in with Hampi, and she was talking about how there was a little bit of difference. So the ornate architecture was forsaken. So next time when Hampi came into being, these were not part of that architecture or temple.
Yeah. Well, this is quite interesting because there is, first of all, a big difference in the building material itself. There are a few Hoysala period temple which are built of sandstone, but most of the temples were built of soapstone, which is very easy to carve, because it's a the black kind of stone that we have. It's easier to carve and it is amenable to great deal of embellishment. The kind of things, the kind of simplicity that you might notice in the Badami Chalukya temples, about which Parul had delivered the first lecture, is something that you don't find in the Hoysalas. It's much embellished, and there's all sort of carvings, not just of animals and salabanjikas, etc., but also line drawings and things such as those. The material actually facilitates that, but that may not be a real explanation, because of course the material, the building material explanation, when you come to Vijayanagar period, it makes some sense because the Vijayanagara rulers are mostly working with granite, and granite is very difficult to carve, at least the kind of carvings that you see in the soapstone or sandstone monuments are more or less impossible when it comes to granite. And granite is the locally available material in places such as Hampi, or in parts of western Andhra, places such as Tadapatri, where you have a good number of Vijayanagar temples. But at the same time, there is the other fact that most of the temples, or at least the places with which Vijayanagara rulers were associated, had a very strong military component itself attached to it, because this was also the so-called Nayaka period, when a large number of people coming mostly from hunting and shepherd backgrounds were becoming military entrepreneurs, and they were gaining gaining service under the state, and they came with their own notions of what warfare was, what security was, and how a place had to be strategically located, and how the geography of the place had to be strategically altered to facilitate some kind of military structure to come up with it. So most of the Vijayanagara temples were also garrisons, so to speak, in one, if not the temples per se, at least the larger locations were strongly garrisoned. I don't think it is possible to make such an argument in the case of a number of Hoysala temples. Somanathapura, for example, I don't think it was in any way connected with military activity, although military personnel were very closely involved in the construction of the temple, in patronizing this, etc. So what politics meant itself had undergone a very significant transformation from the time of the Hoysalas to the 15th or 16th century, when the Vijayanagar rulers were ruling. So this change in royal policy reflects in their architecture as well. So you come up with massive structures, gopurams, etc., but not the kind of carvings that you might notice in the Hoysala temple.
Thank you. Anchit had a question. Anchit, you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, this is about the destruction of Nalanda. No, we actually do not have evidence for that, because the source that we have, there's only one source for that, which is Juzjani's text. And this text doesn't name Nalanda. It only points to a location which appears to be Vikramashila. And much has been written about that in recent times. But this particular text itself, Juzjani's text itself, is available in translation. So I would not recommend any secondary reading. I would actually suggest that you look at the primary source itself, because that is the only text from which this whole story of the destruction of Nalanda has been woven, and that text does not say this.
Brahmari, you want to ask your question? It's nice to have participant voices coming in.
Namaste, sir. I'm again here asking about dance patronage. I'm a Bharatanatyam performer and interested in history about evolution of dance in India. So I just wanted to know if you could suggest some readings on patronage to dance in Puri Jagannatha Temple. Because we are so much influenced by Jayadeva's Ashtapadi even today.
Yeah. Patronage, I would say it is, there are a number of papers that keep coming occasionally in places such as Odisha Review. Odisha Review is a famous journal. It's not a journal, it's a kind of mouthpiece of the Odisha state government. It's a monthly publication. Soft copies of that are available on their website itself. You could look at that, but I don't consider that they are quite scholarly. They're not really scholarly. The book that I would recommend, I forget the title of the book. This is by Margaret Alpin. She has studied the Devadasi system in the Puri Jagannath Temple, Mahari dance, how it underwent a transformation. Alpin, Alpin.
Okay.
Yeah, so she is the authority on the Mahari dance as far as the Puri Jagannatha Temple is concerned. She has a few articles as well, and she has a whole book on that. I recommend that you look at this book. It will be very helpful to you. It is something like, if you're familiar with Saskia Karsimbum's work on South India, Nitya Sumangali.
Yes.
It's the Odia equivalent of that.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Take the question. It's about the pilgrimage sites and why they are, I mean, what accounts for their longevity, Kashi, Gaya.
Okay. So another question that I see, can you please retell the name of the primary text? It's Tabaqat-e-Naziri. Tabaqat-e-Naziri. Tabaqat-e-Nasiri. That's the name of the text. It is by Minazul Siraj Juzjani. Now, the other question was, I have two questions. Firstly, if you could please elaborate on the example of Kashi, Gaya, etc., which you had hinted at in your paper with regard to their longevity. And secondly, as I am really interested in the interactions of Odisha with Southeast Asia, I want to know the kind of role the location of Puri next to the sea might have played. Okay. The Skanda Puran actually has sections on Kashi. There's a whole Kashi Khand there. It's fairly extensive, and we know from a surviving manuscript from the early 9th century that there was an earlier version of the Kashi Khand, which was completely different and much more shorter than what we have now. There again, you do find this kind of an antagonism with royal authority, because the king in Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya is Indradyumna. The one in Kashi Khand is someone called Divodasa, about whom you have a reference in the Rig Veda itself. Now, he is thought to be the king, and he's a demon king actually. And the narrative as it unfolds actually shows some kind of apathy towards royal authority. So you have that in the case of Kashi as well. But what is interesting is that there is a kind of a middle ground that the Skanda Purana tries to occupy when it comes to Tirupati. There is this segment called the Venkatachala Mahatmya, which speaks about the Tirupati temple. There, of course, you have many legendary kings being named, but one of them is a king called Tondaiman. Tondaiman, interestingly, is the title of the Pallava king. So he's actually a real king, unlike your Indradyumna or Divodasa, who might mostly be mythical characters. Tondaiman is actually a historical king, and there is there are a series of legends about Tondaiman which the Venkatachala Mahatmya actually speaks. So in that sense, the Skanda Purana is a very complex text. But what is interesting for me is that you do not have substantial parts of this text celebrating this ideal of royalty. Normally, royalty is always kept at arm's distance. That makes it fairly interesting. And in the context of Puri, we do have epigraphic evidence dating back from an earlier time, and we can actually see how the cult itself underwent changes several times. And when you place those changes against the backdrop of what the Skanda Purana, the Purushottam Kshetra Mahatmya, is trying to say, you notice that the compilers of the Puranas are actually familiar with some of the major historical shifts that might have happened in the evolution of the temple itself. They know that there was an earlier image made of blue chloride, Nilamani. We do have epigraphic reference for that. But when the text was compiled a few centuries later, the compilers or composers were familiar with this particular story. So obviously they might have also been familiar with Chodaganga. They might have also been familiar with Ananga Bhima and all the other rulers who were associated with the temple. None of them figure in the Mahatmya. So this is why I feel that there is a political content to the whole text.
Benel, you want to go ahead with your question? Please ask.
Oh, okay. Professor Manu, thank you once again. I think, yeah, it is always so good to hear you. I had a quick question.
No, I'm not very happy with what happened today because I'm in a hurry to do certain things. The other day it was quite fun.
Yeah, I had a quick question, and I've mentioned there, like, I wanted to understand the difference between Sun Temple at Konark and the Puri Temple, because say Sun Temple was created a little like a century later, but the maintenance, is it also about shifting allegiance of the royalty and the social forces? Would you want to throw some light on that?
Yeah, the Sun Temple was actually built by Narasimha, who happens to be the son of Ananga Bhima. And Ananga Bhima, as I said, was the king who changed the cult in the Puri temple. He replaced Purushottama and Lakshmi with what we have now. And this was a stone image, and he replaced it with the images made of wood. Narasimha was his son, and we do not really know if he was able to complete the temple. What we know is that until the early 19th century, at least some part of the Garbhagriha was still intact, because you have line drawings made by people such as Sterling from the early half of the 19th century. The whole of the Vimana may not exist, but a part of it was still surviving. But that also is gone by the time you come to the early 20th century. Besides, there is one major piece of innovation that he is trying to do. The temples until the early 13th century, the Odisha temples had only two cells. You had the Garbhagriha, and in front of that you had the Mandapa, which they called the Jagamohana. These were two cell structures. Today, of course, it is a four cell structure, but that is the result of innovations in the course of the 16th and 17th century. But Narasimha, when he built the Sun Temple, he introduces a third cell that is mostly incomplete. This is the Natya Mandapa. So that's the third cell. Most of the temples now have a Natya Mandapa followed by a Bhoga Mandapa, which is the fourth cell. So the Natya Mandapa is already imagined in the time of Narasimha himself. But there is a gap between the Natya Mandapa and the main image. If you've gone to Puri, you notice that there is the Garbhagriha, and the main structure that we have is actually the Mandapa. And after that, you come down through a flight of steps, and then you have the Natya Mandapa. In between, there is a passageway. So it is conceived in very different terms, so to speak. Now, what was the purpose of this particular temple? Why was he so megalomaniac? We really don't know. And he chose a very bad building material for that, because most of the temples in Odisha were built of sandstone, very strong and very a durable kind of sandstone. Most of the Bhubaneswar temples are made of that, but the Puri temple was made of condolite, and the Sun temple was also made of condolite, and it's a very poor quality condolite. So in fact, the Puri temple is one of the most repaired temples in India. Every 10 years there's a repair work that starts, and it goes on for at least 2-3 years. The last time it was in 2016. It went on up to 2018. So in that sense, besides, you do not have the kind of narratives for for Konark that you have for Puri. the Puri temple has a text called Madala Panji, which is a temple documents preserved by the priests there. You have texts such as the Purushottama Kshetra Mahatmya. You have the Panchasaka legends concerning them. So you have rich textual sources with which to examine that history. You don't have that for the Konark temple. All you have is a 19th century legend which says that this gentleman, Narasimha, had a tail and he was ashamed of it, and somebody told him that the tail would just disappear if he builds a temple for the sun. And together with that, there were also a few other things added to this legend. This is actually a 19th century legend. It said that the original Vimana had a huge magnet, and this magnet was meant to attract the ships that were sailing in the sea. So you had these kind of fantastic stories that come up in the 19th century. But before the 19th century, you do not have narrative accounts about the temple. All you have is the surviving remains, the sculpture there, and things such as these.
Thank you, Professor.
Are there any other questions? We are almost running out of time. No? Okay, then we'll bring the session to a close. I actually particularly enjoyed this session very much because it was a masterclass in how one does medieval history. And I don't think any of the participants will ever be content to just go to a temple again without taking down the volumes of the epigraphic volumes, looking up inscriptions, looking up the Sthala Puranas, etc. So thank you very much, Professor Devadevan, and I'll hand it over to Tanu.
Thank you, Amel. Thank you.